The storm before the awakening. The summer heat clung to the cracked pavement like syrup, thick and relentless, curling off the Chicago sidewalks in hazy waves. In a quiet pocket of the South Side, where the air hung heavy with the mingling aromas of grilled ribs, engine exhaust, and the faint tang of hot asphalt, a woman named Loretta Mayfield sat on her porch, rocking gently in a weathered wicker chair. Loretta was 54 years old and carried the weight of each year in the stoic set of her jaw and the careful light in her eyes. Those eyes had seen neighborhoods rise and fall, babies grow into restless teenagers, and men disappear into the maw of prison or addiction. Through it all, she held her corner of 87th Street together. A modest two-story home with flaking paint on the porch railing and a front yard that was more cracked dirt than grass. But her rose bushes, stubborn as she was, bloomed in defiance of it all. Loretta was a survivor of loss, of heartbreak, of a system that rarely left room for grace. Her husband had passed from a stroke in his early 50s, leaving her to raise their only daughter, Kenya Mayfield, alone. Kenya had been a curious, brilliant child, the kind of girl who asked why the sky was blue at 4 and could reassemble a toaster at 7. Loretta used to call her my little scientist, proud of the mind her daughter wielded like a blade against the world. But Kenya had left home years ago, to college, then to a government job Loretta barely understood. She called when she could, voice bright but guarded, always talking around the edges of her life. Loretta knew whatever Kenya was doing, it was important. Dangerous, maybe. But Loretta had learned not to ask too many questions. A mother knows when her child's truth is locked behind a door they can't open. It was that same steely patience Loretta carried with her on the porch that day when the quiet was shattered by the high-pitched wail of sirens. 2 police cruisers lurched to a halt right outside her gate, their tires kicking up dust and litter from the curb. Red and blue lights flickered wildly against her windows, a chaotic reflection of something too familiar. Sirens were nothing new in her neighborhood, but when they stopped right outside her house, that was different. Loretta set aside her glass of iced tea, the condensation slicking her palm, and stood. She shaded her eyes with her hand, squinting against the glare of the afternoon sun. 4 officers emerged from the vehicles, each with the purposeful stiffness of men expecting trouble. Trouble they weren't going to find here. Not on her porch. She stepped to the edge of her porch, her spine straight, her voice clear. "Afternoon, officers. What brings you to my door?" The lead officer, a tall, lean man with a pale, angular face and mirrored sunglasses, glanced around the block like he was evaluating a battlefield. His badge gleamed against his chest. Sergeant Dean Wilcox. Behind him, a shorter, stockier officer with a square face and restless hands hovered by the gate, fingers flexing near his hip. The other 2 officers hung back, their gazes sliding over the house and yard, like hawks circling. "Ma'am," Wilcox said, his voice clipped, his tone heavy with suspicion. "We received a report about suspicious activity in this area. Do you live here?" Loretta's hands settled on her hips. Born and raised. What kind of suspicious activity are we talking about? Wilcox glanced at his notebook, but Loretta could tell from the tightness in his shoulders that the report didn't really matter. A tip came in. Something about packages being delivered here. Possibly narcotics. Loretta's eyebrows shot up. Narcotics. At my house. The other officer, the stocky one, his name tag read Officer Carrington, stepped closer. His dark eyes locked on hers, unblinking. "Mind if we come inside and have a look around?" Loretta's stomach clenched. Years of living here taught her that once police stepped into your house, they could make whatever they wanted out of what they found, or didn't find. And the word of a black woman meant very little against the weight of a police report. "You got a warrant?" she asked, voice even. Carrington shifted, his mouth tightening. Wilcox didn't smile, but something about the way he cocked his head suggested amusement, like he thought Loretta didn't know her rights. "No, ma'am," Wilcox said. "We're just asking for your cooperation." "Cooperation gets black folks buried," Loretta said quietly. Unless you have a warrant, officers, I won't be inviting you in. Wilcox's jaw flexed. That's your right, he said after a beat. But we'll be keeping a close eye on this property. Loretta stood firm as they turned back to their cars. The tension lingered even after the cruisers pulled away, the silence too loud. Behind curtains and half-open windows, neighbors had been watching. Always watching. Loretta went back inside, her hands trembling only after the door was locked. She could handle this. She'd handled worse. But a whisper of doubt curled in her gut. A mother's instinct, the kind that sharpened into certainty when something was truly wrong. She picked up her phone and scrolled to the contact labeled simply, Kenya. The phone rang twice before her daughter answered. Hey, Mama. Kenya's voice was warm, soft around the edges. What's up? Loretta took a breath. Some officers came by. Said they got a tip I was getting drug packages. There was a beat of silence. Then, what? Loretta told her everything. The cruisers, the questions, the thinly veiled threat. She could hear Kenya's breathing quicken, but her daughter's voice remained calm. Did they show you any paperwork? Nope. Okay. Kenya's voice shifted, the softness dissolving into something colder, harder. Listen to me, Mama. Don't let them in without a warrant. Don't answer any more questions. And if they come back, you call me first. Loretta heard something underneath her daughter's voice. Not just worry, but the unmistakable edge of authority. Baby, what's going on? A long pause stretched between them. It's complicated, Mama, Kenya said softly. But I'll take care of it. I promise. After they hung up, Loretta stood at the window, arms folded, watching the block. Her gut told her this was more than a random call. Someone had singled her out. But why? She wasn't a threat to anyone. Or was she? That night, sleep was a stranger. Every creak of the house made her heart race. She finally gave up trying around 3 a.m., sitting in her living room with the lights low. The only sound was the slow tick of the old clock above the mantel. Somewhere out there, someone wanted her afraid. And they were about to find out that Loretta Mayfield wasn't the kind of woman who scared easy. Meanwhile, in a secure operations center deep in Virginia, Kenya Mayfield sat in a dimly lit room, 6 monitors casting a cold blue glow over her face. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up databases, cross-referencing the officers' names, combing through sealed files accessible only to those with the highest clearance. Her colleagues called her Ghost Whisper, a handler so skilled at extracting truth from noise that her work became legend at Langley. Operations from Eastern Europe to the Sahel bore her invisible fingerprints. She had walked through war zones in the dead of night and exfiltrated assets from the heart of hostile regimes. But none of it had ever felt this personal. The system showed Wilcox's name flagged. Twice. Internal affairs reports buried under layers of red tape. Kenya leaned closer, her pulse hammering in her ears. Whatever was coming for her mother had started long before that cruiser rolled up. It was time to bring Ghost Whisper home. Shadows in the soil. The sun had barely crested the horizon, burning the sky a muted copper when Loretta stood at her kitchen sink, staring out over her back fence. A wind had kicked up overnight, scattering paper cups and broken leaves across her patchy yard. The wind couldn't sweep away the weight sitting on her chest. Loretta's phone sat nearby on the counter, within arm's reach. Since Kenya's call the night before, she'd kept it closer than usual, like a lifeline to something steady in a world suddenly tilting beneath her feet. Her daughter's voice had been calm, but Loretta knew that calm well. It was the voice Kenya used when she was holding something back. And Loretta had long since learned that the more Kenya kept secret, the more dangerous things really were. A soft knock came at the front door, sharp and measured, like someone accustomed to authority. Loretta's pulse kicked up, but she steadied herself. She moved through the house quietly, eyes flicking through each window. No police cars this time. Just a woman on her porch, brown-skinned, mid-30s, her hair pulled into neat braids, and wearing a navy pantsuit that didn't quite hide the bulge of a sidearm beneath the tailored fabric. Loretta opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" The woman offered a brief smile, professional and distant. Mrs. Mayfield, my name is Agent Camille Rivers. I work with the Department of Homeland Security. She held up her credentials, the kind of plastic and laminate that carried serious weight. I was hoping to speak with you. Homeland Security. Loretta's stomach twisted into knots. About what? Agent Rivers didn't answer directly. Can I come in? I promise I won't take too much of your time. Loretta hesitated, Kenya's warning ringing in her ears. Don't let anyone in without a warrant. But this wasn't some patrol cop fishing for an excuse to violate her rights. This was something else entirely. Reluctantly, she stepped aside. Agent Rivers entered, her sharp eyes taking in the house with a glance. The worn but spotless floors, the crocheted doilies on the end tables, the photos on the mantel. Her gaze lingered on a framed picture of Loretta and Kenya, taken at Kenya's college graduation. The pride in Loretta's eyes was unmistakable. The agent sat at the dining table, folding her hands neatly in front of her. Mrs. Mayfield, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not here by chance. Your name has come up in connection with some ongoing investigations. Loretta's heart skipped. What kind of investigations? Corruption, Rivers said bluntly. Police corruption tied to property redevelopment schemes in the South Side. It's the kind of operation where certain officers use harassment and fabricated charges to force long-time residents off their property. Once the owners are out, those properties end up in the hands of developers at cut-rate prices. Loretta's breath caught. And you think I'm part of that? No, Rivers said quickly. You're the target, but it's more complicated than that. The agent leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. We know about your daughter. Loretta's spine stiffened. What about her? Rivers met her gaze, her expression softening just slightly. Kenya Mayfield isn't just a government employee, Mrs. Mayfield. She's one of the most skilled intelligence operatives the CIA has produced in the last decade. Her work has saved lives, both overseas and here at home. Loretta's hands trembled on the table, but she said nothing. She'd suspected Kenya's work was dangerous, but hearing it confirmed, from a stranger, no less, felt like the ground was shifting beneath her. What does my daughter have to do with some shady developers in Chicago? Loretta asked, her voice sharp with protective anger. Possibly nothing, Rivers admitted. But it's also possible someone in that developer circle discovered Kenya's real identity, or at least that she works in intelligence. There's a reason they're targeting you so aggressively. Loretta's lips pressed into a thin line. They want her to come running. Rivers nodded. That's one theory. Either to flush her out or to force her to intervene in a way that could damage her career or compromise her cover. Loretta stood abruptly, pacing to the window, arms crossed tight over her chest. So my baby comes home to protect me, and these vultures get exactly what they want. Not if we get ahead of them, Rivers said. Kenya's not alone in this, Mrs. Mayfield. There are people in the government who still care about protecting their own. But we need your help. Loretta turned, suspicion flashing in her eyes. Help how? Let Kenya know we've made contact. Tell her you were visited by Homeland Security, but don't let anyone else in the neighborhood know. We'll be in touch with Kenya directly, and we'll need her cooperation to uncover who's really behind this. Loretta's fingers tightened around the back of a chair. And what if I say no? What if I just pack a bag and leave, take Kenya, and go somewhere they can't find us? Rivers' expression hardened. They'll follow. And you won't be able to look over your shoulder forever. Besides, Kenya doesn't run. She fights. Loretta knew that was true. Her daughter had been a fighter since the day she was born. And a mother's instinct told her, no matter what dangers lay ahead, Kenya wouldn't abandon her now. All right, Loretta said quietly. I'll tell her. Rivers stood, extending her hand. Thank you, Mrs. Mayfield. And for what it's worth, you raised a hell of a woman. Loretta shook her hand, firm and unflinching. I know. Langley, Virginia. 3 hours later. Kenya sat at her desk, earbuds in, scanning satellite images from an Eastern European port, when her encrypted phone vibrated. The name flashing on the screen made her stomach twist. Mom. She answered immediately. Mama, you okay? There was a pause, just long enough for Kenya to know something was wrong. I'm fine, baby, but someone from Homeland Security came by today. Kenya sat bolt upright. Homeland Security. What did they want? Loretta relayed the conversation word for word, her voice steady despite the growing fear underneath. When she finished, Kenya's knuckles were white around the phone. Listen to me, Kenya said, her voice low and lethal. From now on, no one comes into the house unless it's me. I don't care if it's the mailman, a preacher, or the mayor. All right, Loretta whispered. Baby, is this because of your work? Kenya's throat tightened. I don't know yet, but I'm coming home. I'll be there tonight. Kenya. No arguments. Kenya cut her off gently. We're in this together. Later that night, Chicago. Loretta stayed awake long after the streetlights came on. She sat by the window, arms folded, her gaze sweeping the block. It felt like the old neighborhood again, before the gentrifiers came sniffing, back when you had to know who was watching which corner and whether the wrong glance could start a feud. At 1:23 a.m., a sleek black SUV crept down the street, headlights dimmed. It slowed in front of Loretta's house for just a heartbeat, long enough for her to see the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat. He wasn't a neighbor, and he wasn't lost. Loretta's phone buzzed. Kenya's voice came through, soft but strong. I'm 2 blocks away. Sit tight. Loretta felt a swell of calm, even as the SUV disappeared into the night. Her daughter was home, and together they were going to burn the whole corrupt system to the ground. The lioness awakens. The streets of Chicago's South Side wore their silence like a second skin in the pre-dawn hours. Most residents knew the language of the neighborhood, the creak of rusted gates, the slap of sneakers on sidewalk, the distant wail of sirens weaving between buildings like restless ghosts. But tonight, Loretta Mayfield wasn't hearing the normal song of her block. She was hearing war drums. A low, nearly imperceptible hum reverberated in the air. The sound of a heavily modified Range Rover rolling slow past the house. Tinted windows blacked out whatever pair of eyes was watching her home. The SUV was just one piece of the unease clawing at her stomach. For 2 days, they'd been circling her block, men in plain clothes pretending not to notice her front porch, a van parked half a block down with antennas sprouting from its roof like crooked fingers. It was surveillance, and sloppy surveillance at that. Someone wanted her to see it. But what they hadn't counted on was who Loretta Mayfield's daughter really was. Kenya stood by the window, motionless as a shadow, her slim figure blending into the living room curtains. She was dressed in black. From the snug tactical pants to the moisture-wicking top, her hair pulled into a low bun. To Loretta, her daughter looked every inch the professional she'd raised. Calm, patient, and lethal when it mattered. Kenya's presence filled the room, not with warmth, but with precision. Even her breathing was measured, like each inhale had been planned a week in advance. Loretta knew better than to interrupt when her daughter slipped into this mindset. It wasn't her little girl standing there. It was the lioness. How many today? Loretta asked quietly, even though she already knew the answer. 3 shifts. Kenya murmured without turning her head. They're rotating cars every 8 hours. Sloppy rotations too. Same faces, same vehicles. This isn't professional surveillance. This is intimidation. Loretta exhaled slowly. They want me to break. No, Kenya corrected, her eyes cold. They want me to break. That was the core of it, the game being played between invisible hands. Someone knew just enough about Kenya to understand her pressure points. And Loretta Mayfield, the unshakable matriarch of 87th Street, was now the bait in someone else's trap. Kenya finally stepped back from the window, her hands on her hips, gaze unfocused, thoughts spinning fast. I need you to tell me everything, Mama. Every piece of mail you've gotten, Every knock on the door, even the weird phone calls. Start from the beginning. Loretta's memory was a steel vault when it needed to be. She sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped, and began cataloging every oddity from the past few months. First, Loretta said, about 2 months ago, someone came by pretending to be from the water department. Said they needed to inspect the pipes under the yard. But they didn't have no uniform, no ID, nothing. I sent him packing. Kenya's brow furrowed. You remember what he looked like. White, about 50, thin face, a little mustache. Didn't look like no plumber to me. Kenya's fingers danced across her tablet, entering the description into a secure system she accessed through encrypted channels. Okay, what else? There was a package, maybe 6 weeks back. No return address, just left on the porch. Kenya's head snapped up. You open it. No, something felt off. I left it in the trash. Kenya made a note to retrieve the garbage records. Even discarded packages might have fingerprints or tracking barcodes. The more Loretta talked, the more Kenya's unease deepened. This wasn't just a land grab. It was a deliberate campaign. They weren't just trying to scare Loretta. They were building a narrative, one that painted Loretta as a liability, the kind of person who might deserve to be removed. Elsewhere, an office with no name. The man in the charcoal suit sat at his desk, scrolling through a digital dossier. A headshot of Kenya Mayfield stared back at him. An old photo from her recruitment file, her smile slight, her eyes sharper than the camera could capture. The man, known only as Mr. Nolan, had overseen dozens of operations like this. But this one was different. Are we certain she knows? Nolan asked, his voice a dry rasp. A woman across the desk, her hair tied back in a severe knot, nodded once. She's aware. Their surveillance was meant to be detected. Nolan tapped the screen, bringing up Loretta's photo beside her daughter's. Mother and daughter, side by side. Kenya Mayfield is a problem. Would you like me to authorize the next step? The woman asked. Nolan's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, though there was no humor in it. Not yet. Let's see how far the lioness will go to protect her den. Back in Chicago, Kenya sat cross-legged on the floor of her childhood bedroom, papers spread around her like a sea of evidence. Property records, developer contracts, names that recurred across different documents, tied by thin, fraying threads of corruption. One name floated to the top again and again, Jonas Reese, a real estate magnate with a taste for gentrification and a reputation for playing dirty. Eminent domain claims that turned into sweetheart deals, sudden code violations filed against homeowners who refused to sell. More than once, community leaders had mysteriously changed their minds after consultations with Reese's people. Kenya's phone buzzed once, a secure line. Go ahead, she answered. It was Martin Delgado, her contact inside the CIA's cybersecurity division. Got something for you, Martin's voice hummed through the line. That black SUV you flagged. It's leased through a shell company, tied to a private security firm out of Schaumburg. Linked to Reese? Kenya asked. Bingo. It's not just surveillance. They're running a psychological operation. Intimidate, isolate, create fear, then move in with an offer to make the fear go away. Kenya's jaw clenched. They're baiting me. Not just you, Martin said. Your mom's house is sitting on top of a planned transit expansion. New light rail connector straight to downtown. They want her out yesterday. Kenya ended the call, the air in the room thickening. She had faced warlords, cartels, and foreign intelligence agencies. But this was home. This was personal. And Reese had made one critical error. He made a move on her mother. The next morning, Loretta answered the door to find Kenya standing there, dressed in black jeans and a worn leather jacket, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. What's in the bag? Loretta asked. Insurance, Kenya replied. They drove across town to an unmarked storage unit. Inside, Kenya unzipped the bag to reveal a portable surveillance system. Small cameras, audio recorders, and encrypted transmitters, military-grade equipment disguised as harmless household items, an air freshener with a pinhole camera, a lamp with a hidden microphone, even a clock that transmitted a live feed directly to Kenya's phone. "What is all this?" Loretta asked. "Eyes and ears," Kenya said. "If they want to play dirty, I want to see every move they make." Over the next 6 hours, Kenya installed the system, her movements fast and efficient. By nightfall, Loretta's house had become a digital fortress. Every window, every entrance, even the alley behind the fence, all under constant surveillance. "If anyone so much as sneezes wrong out there," Kenya said, "we'll know." Loretta watched her daughter work, the little girl who used to fall asleep reading encyclopedias now moving like a ghost through her own home, turning it into a battlefield. Pride and fear warred in Loretta's chest. "You've done this before," Loretta said softly. Kenya paused, her hands resting on the back of the couch. "More times than I can count." "Did you ever think it would be for me?" Kenya's smile was small but fierce. "No one messes with my mother." Outside, the black SUV rolled by again. But this time, Kenya's cameras captured every angle. The predator had stepped into the trap, and Kenya Mayfield was ready to snap it shut. The devil's smile. The midday sun sat high and merciless over the south side, baking the pavement until it shimmered like a sheet of molten glass. On 87th Street, windows were cracked open just enough to let in air, but not trouble. Residents of the block knew better than to be seen lingering for too long, especially now, because the vultures were circling. Kenya sat at the small kitchen table, her back to the wall, eyes scanning 2 screens at once, her phone in one hand, her laptop balanced on the table's edge. The feed from her covered cameras streamed onto both, filling the room with the quiet buzz of real-time surveillance. Every angle of her mother's property was covered. The narrow gangway between houses, the alley behind the backyard, the front porch, and even the street beyond. On screen, a black SUV was parked just past the stop sign. Same vehicle, different driver. This one was younger, lean, with a sunburned neck and a perpetual scowl. He'd been sitting there for the past hour, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, eyes flicking constantly toward the house. "He's nervous," Kenya muttered, more to herself than to Loretta, who was stirring a pot of greens at the stove. "Why?" Loretta asked without turning around. "Because I'm here." Kenya's voice was quiet but certain. "They don't know how much I know, or what I'm capable of, but they know enough to be afraid." Loretta tapped the wooden spoon on the edge of the pot, shaking her head. This used to be a neighborhood where folks knew each other's business, but it was mostly harmless. You knew which kids were skipping school and which houses to avoid after dark, but nobody was running a damn operation. Kenya leaned back, fingers tapping a rhythmless beat on the tabletop. "This isn't about your neighbors, Mama. This is about power, and how far some people are willing to go to keep it." Before Loretta could reply, Kenya's phone lit up with an incoming encrypted call. She stood, stepping into the hallway for privacy. "Go." It was Martin Delgado, her contact at CIA Cyber Operations. "Got that trace you asked for?" "The SUV. It's registered to a holding company called South Shore Logistics, which is a fancy way of saying nothing." "Shell company," Kenya guessed. "Bingo," Martin confirmed. "But the payments, they link back to Jonas Reese. And guess what? Reese's firm has been in quiet talks with the city about a revitalization project focused on, wait for it, 87th Street. Kenya's grip on the phone tightened. "So it's official. They want her property." "They don't just want it," Martin said grimly. "They need it. Your mom's house sits on the corner lot. It's the linchpin for the whole development." Kenya's mind raced. "And if they can't buy it?" "They'll take it another way," Martin finished. "Zoning violations, fake inspections, even planted evidence if it comes to that. They've done it before, just never with this much attention." Kenya ended the call, her blood running hot. They weren't just trying to take Loretta's home. They were trying to erase her. Not on my watch. The man in the suit. Later that afternoon, Loretta was on the porch pruning her roses when a black Cadillac Escalade rolled up. Not the usual SUV. This was something else, something slick and deliberate. The rear passenger door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, lean, dressed in a perfectly cut navy suit that cost more than most mortgages on this block. His smile was a weapon, sharp and gleaming, and he walked with the unbothered confidence of someone who believed the world was already his. "Mrs. Mayfield," he called smoothly, climbing the steps with a leisurely grace. "I was hoping we could have a word." Loretta didn't move. She stood straight, trimming shears still in her hand. "You got business, you can talk to my lawyer." The man's smile never wavered. Now. No need for hostility. "My name is Jonas Reese. I'm a developer working with the city on some very exciting projects for this area." "You mean the projects that don't include us," Loretta said coldly. Reese sighed like a parent disappointed in a difficult child. "Change is always uncomfortable at first, but I wanted to offer you something before things get messy." Kenya stepped onto the porch before Loretta could respond. Her presence shifted the air. Reese's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time, his smile wavered, just a hair. "And you are?" he asked. "Her daughter." Kenya's voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. "You're standing on her porch, which means you're already trespassing." Reese's smile returned, though it was thinner now. "You must be Kenya Mayfield. I've heard about you." Kenya's eyes narrowed. "I doubt that." "Small world," Reese shrugged. "People talk." Kenya took a step closer. "Let me save us both some time. Whatever offer you're about to make, you can keep it. My mother's not selling, not leaving, and definitely not scared." Reese's smile dropped entirely. For a moment, something colder flickered in his eyes. "You're making a mistake." Kenya leaned in, close enough that only Reese could hear. "No, you made the mistake when you came for my mother." Reese's jaw clenched. "This neighborhood's changing, one way or another." "Then maybe," Kenya said, her voice low, "you picked the wrong block." Reese took a step back, smoothing his suit as though brushing off invisible dust. "I hope you reconsider." He turned and walked down the steps, back into his Escalade. It purred away, leaving the silence thicker than before. Loretta exhaled. "He's gonna come back." Kenya nodded. "I'm counting on it." Laying the trap. That night, Kenya sat in front of her laptop, headphones on, assembling a digital dossier on Reese and his entire operation. Property grabs, fake citations, payoffs to zoning officials. It was a laundry list of corruption, held together by thin strands of plausible deniability. She didn't need plausible deniability. She needed proof. By 3:00 a.m., she had it. Emails leaked from a disgruntled employee at Reese's firm detailed plans to force Loretta off her property, including staged police raids, harassment campaigns, and, if necessary, a planted package of narcotics. They were building a case before the crime even happened. Kenya leaned back in her chair, adrenaline thrumming through her veins. She had what she needed to bury them. But it wasn't enough to leak it to the press or hand it to internal affairs. She needed to confront Reese directly and make him understand, once and for all, that the Mayfield family was not prey. Showdown. The next evening, Kenya left Loretta at the house with instructions to stay inside, lock the doors, and call if so much as a shadow moved wrong. Then Kenya, dressed in dark jeans and a plain hoodie, walked straight into the lobby of Reese Global Development. The receptionist barely had time to stammer a greeting before Kenya flashed a fake consultant badge and strode into the executive suite. Reese was behind his desk, sipping from a crystal tumbler, when Kenya opened the door. "You're not on my calendar," he said smoothly. Kenya tossed a thick folder onto his desk. "Consider this an unscheduled appointment." Reese flipped open the folder, his smile faltering as he recognized his own company's documents, his own emails, his own orders to destroy Loretta Mayfield. "How did you?" "You came after my mother," Kenya interrupted, her voice a lethal whisper. "That was your second mistake." Reese's eyes narrowed. "What was the first?" Kenya leaned in, her face inches from his. "Underestimating me." The silence hung heavy. Reese knew a threat when he heard one. But Kenya wasn't bluffing. The folder was just a taste. She had enough to blow up his entire operation. "Pull your people off my mother. Cancel the harassment. Walk away." Kenya's voice dropped. "Or I burn everything you built to the ground." Reese's jaw tightened, but Kenya saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. He knew. Kenya Mayfield was the wrong enemy. When lions hunt. The Chicago night was a restless thing. The streets breathed in gasps, bursts of car horns, the muffled bass of passing music, the occasional angry shout or barking dog. Even in silence, the city pulsed, alive with unseen movement. But this night felt different. The air was too still, the shadows too long. From the second-story window of her childhood bedroom, Kenya Mayfield could feel the neighborhood watching her, just as surely as she was watching it. The surveillance feeds on her laptop flickered in rotating grids. The porch, the gangway, the back fence, the alley, the street. Every angle of Loretta Mayfield's house was covered, a digital fortress wrapped around the last safe place Kenya had left. Her mother's sanctuary had become a battlefield. It wasn't the first time Kenya had built a fortress, but it was the first time she'd had to do it for home. At the kitchen table, Loretta stirred a cup of tea with the steady rhythm of someone trying to focus on something tangible, something normal. She didn't ask questions, didn't flinch at the cameras or the loaded duffel bag by the door. She trusted Kenya to handle it, just like she always had. But Kenya saw the tension in her mother's shoulders. Loretta Mayfield was no fool. She knew they were dancing at the edge of something dangerous, something that wouldn't just knock politely on the door. "Tea's getting cold," Loretta called softly. Kenya left the window, padding down the stairs in socked feet. It was a small thing, but she couldn't bring herself to wear shoes in her mother's house. Not after all these years. The floorboards creaked, remembering her weight. She sat across from Loretta, taking the cup her mother pushed toward her. Chamomile. The same tea Loretta made every time Kenya came home sick from school or after a fight with a classmate. A warmth spread through her. And for a moment, she wasn't the CIA's ghost operative. She was just Kenya Mayfield, Loretta's daughter. "How bad is it, really?" Loretta's voice was quiet. Kenya set her cup down carefully. "Bad." Loretta sighed, eyes cast down at her own reflection in the tea. "I always knew there was more to your work than what you said." Kenya's lips quirked in a half smile. "You never asked." "Because I knew you'd tell me when you were ready." Loretta's gaze lifted, steady and clear. "Are you ready now?" Kenya looked at her mother, the woman who had held everything together with grit and prayer, who had shielded her from every storm except the one brewing now. "There are things I've done, Mama," Kenya said softly. "Things I can't talk about. But everything I did was for the right reasons, to protect people, to protect this country." Loretta's fingers curled around her mug. "And now? Now it's personal." A shadow crossed Loretta's face. "I don't want you throwing away your life for me." Kenya's hand covered her mother's. "You're my life." Before Loretta could reply, Kenya's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. Martin Delgado. Kenya stepped into the living room to take the call. "Talk to me." "Your friend Jonas Reese." Martin's voice was low, clipped. "He's been busy." Kenya's spine straightened. "What now?" "After your little visit to his office, he made a call. Burner phone to burner phone, but we tracked it through cell tower drift." Martin paused. He called in muscle. Kenya's pulse slowed, cold and steady. "Local?" "Mostly. A few out-of-state names in the mix. None of them clean." "Contractors?" "Worse." Martin's tone darkened. "Ex-cops." Private security guys with violent records. People who know how to make someone disappear without leaving evidence. Kenya exhaled through her nose. She had seen it before. Developers hiring private muscle to do the dirty work the police couldn't officially handle. Intimidation crews who planted drugs, staged break-ins, or worse. And Reese, arrogant as he was, had just escalated to that level. Names? Kenya asked. I'll send the file. But Kenya, this isn't just scare tactics anymore. They're clearing the board. If Reese can't scare your mom off, he'll push you into a confrontation. Then make sure you don't walk away. Kenya's fingers curled into a fist at her side. He's about to find out what happens when you corner the wrong lion. She ended the call, turning back toward the kitchen, but something in the surveillance feed caught her eye. The alley camera. A figure, hooded and lean, slipped along the fence line. Careful but quick. Kenya's pulse didn't spike. Her mind sharpened. Movement like that wasn't amateur. It was trained. Without a word, Kenya grabbed her hoodie and slid it on, tucking her phone into the pocket. Loretta barely had time to ask, "Where are you going?" before Kenya was at the back door. "Stay inside," Kenya said over her shoulder. "Lock up." The back door whispered shut, and Kenya slipped into the yard, her steps silent on the cracked concrete. She moved low, hugging the shadows cast by the fence. The figure was halfway down the alley, glancing over their shoulder now and then, alert, but not alert enough. Kenya tracked them for a full block before making her move. The figure turned a corner, and Kenya surged forward, grabbing the intruder's wrist and spinning them hard into the brick wall. The hood fell back, revealing a wiry young man, barely older than 20, his eyes wide with fear and adrenaline. "Please," he stammered. "I'm not." Kenya's hand clamped over his mouth. "Don't lie to me." Her voice was calm, but the edge was razor-sharp. "Who sent you?" The kid's breath came fast and shallow. "They said just to watch," he gasped. "That's all." "Who?" He shook his head. "I don't know his name. I swear." Kenya's fingers tightened around his wrist. "Describe him." "White guy, late 40s. Fancy suit, but with, scars on his knuckles. Like he's been in fights." Kenya's mind clicked through the files Martin had sent earlier. One name matched. Darren Kincaid, former Chicago PD, fired after a brutality complaint that left a man with permanent brain damage. Now working for Reese's security. "Go home," Kenya said, releasing the kid. "And if anyone asks, you never saw me." The kid bolted, sneakers slapping pavement. Kenya stood alone in the alley, the night pressing in around her. They were closing in, but she wasn't trapped. They were. Reese's last mistake. The next afternoon, Kenya's surveillance caught something new. A white Ford Econoline van, the kind contractors used, parked across from Loretta's house. Two men inside, both ex-cops with sealed records Kenya had already unlocked. They weren't watching anymore. They were preparing. Kenya didn't wait. She walked across the street, right up to the driver's side window, and knocked. The man inside rolled it down, startled. "Can I help you?" Kenya's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, tell Reese this is his one warning. The next time I catch you outside my mother's house, I'm not knocking." The driver smirked. "Is that a threat?" Kenya leaned in close. "No," she whispered. "It's a promise." She turned and walked back inside, leaving the men to sweat. They drove off 5 minutes later. Kenya sat at the kitchen table, hands steepled, eyes on the surveillance feeds. She wasn't waiting for them to come back. She was waiting for Reese himself. Because when the lion hunts, she doesn't chase. She waits. Reckoning at dawn. The sky above the south side of Chicago was still bruised with night when Kenya Mayfield stepped out onto the front porch, barefoot. The cracked wood was cool beneath her feet, the air heavy with the scent of damp concrete, fried grease from a nearby corner stand, and the distant metallic tang of a coming storm. It was the smell of her childhood. But this wasn't a night for nostalgia. Loretta stood just behind the screen door, arms folded tightly, trying to hide the worry on her face. Her daughter, her brilliant, secretive daughter, had always been a force, but tonight there was something different in Kenya's stance. The stillness wasn't hesitation. It was the sharpened stillness of a predator who had chosen her ground. "How sure are you about this?" Loretta asked softly. Kenya didn't turn around. Her eyes were fixed on the block, scanning the length of 87th Street, the way a sniper surveys a hillside. "As sure as I've ever been." "They'll come ready," Loretta warned. "They're not afraid to put people in the ground." Kenya's lips curled into something too cold to be a smile. "Neither am I." Loretta wanted to object, to remind her daughter that this wasn't a war zone, that this was home. But the words didn't come, because she knew, to Kenya, it was all the same battlefield. The bait and the hook. The files Kenya had pulled from Martin Delgado's network trace were damning. Property grabs disguised as urban renewal, phony arrests, forced foreclosures, all orchestrated by Jonas Reese, his dirty money coursing through shell companies, and bought cops like poison in the veins of the city. But none of it mattered without leverage. Information alone didn't scare men like Reese. They didn't fear exposure. They expected it. They had built their careers on the assumption that no one would care enough to stop them. That was why Kenya's plan wasn't about exposure. It was about fear. At exactly 4:12 a.m., a burner phone in Kenya's pocket buzzed. Martin's voice, scratchy but urgent. They bit. Kenya's fingers tightened around the phone. Location: 2 vehicles, both unmarked. Heading toward your block now. They'd brought more than surveillance. Kenya didn't need him to say it. Guns. Backup. Men who knew how to break doors and bones with equal precision. "Good," Kenya said. "Keep the line open." She ended the call and turned back inside. Loretta stood at the kitchen table, the tension in her shoulders carved from granite. "Do you have to do this alone?" Loretta asked quietly. Kenya walked over, kissed her mother's forehead. "You've done your part, Mama. You raised me." Loretta's voice was barely a whisper. "Just come back." The approach. The streetlights flickered as the 2 vehicles rolled to a stop at the far end of the block. Blacked-out SUVs, low-slung and predatory. Kenya's cameras caught them from every angle. The men stepping out, thick-necked and slow-moving, the kind of men who had worn badges long enough to know all the loopholes. Kincaid was among them, the scared ex-cop with hands like bricks. He lit a cigarette, blowing smoke into the pre-dawn air. "Front and back," Kincaid muttered. "Sweep the house. Nobody gets loud unless we have to." They thought they were running the playbook. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. The first warning. Kenya let them come halfway up the front yard before she stepped out of the shadows, the porch light framing her like a ghost risen from the ground itself. "Morning," she said, voice calm. Kincaid froze. "Who the hell are you?" Kenya smiled. "The last person you'll ever underestimate." He reached for his gun, but Kenya's hand was faster, lifting a small remote. "Before you pull that trigger," she said, "I suggest you check your pockets." Kincaid frowned, patting his coat. His fingers closed around something small, a square, slick object. A memory card. Where the hell did this? Kenya took a step down the porch stairs, eyes locked on his. "That's a complete record of every conversation you've had with Reese for the past 6 months. Payments, plans, even the deal you made to plant evidence on my mother." Kincaid's face darkened, cigarette trembling between his fingers. "You don't know who you're messing with." Kenya's voice dropped into the kind of calm that sent men running in every language. "No, you don't." The backdoor gambit. While Kenya confronted Kincaid, 2 other men slipped toward the backyard, skirting the fence line. They moved with a tactical rhythm, covering each other's flanks, weapons low but ready. Kenya had counted on that. The moment their boots crossed the motion sensor near the back porch, a floodlight snapped on, blinding them. One of the men cursed, shielding his eyes, which was why he didn't see the drone hovering above him until it was too late. The drone's camera beamed their images directly to Kenya's phone and to a secure server at a friendly newsroom downtown. Kenya's voice rang out from a hidden speaker. "Smile, boys. You're live." The men froze. "You step 1 foot closer to my mother's house," Kenya said, "and I upload the rest." They turned tail, stumbling back into the alley, running blind into the dark. Reese arrives. The black Escalade slid up moments later, more careful than the SUVs. Reese stepped out, his perfect suit untouched by the tension around him. He walked with that same arrogant grace, but Kenya saw the flicker in his eyes. He was worried. "Miss Mayfield," Reese said, his voice smooth as glass, "this isn't necessary." "Neither was sending armed men to my mother's house," Kenya replied. Reese's smile faltered. "You've made some serious accusations." Kenya tossed a tablet onto the hood of his car. On it, a video began to play. A recorded call between Reese and Kincaid, detailing exactly how they planned to drive Loretta Mayfield off her property. "Do you want this to go live on every local news station?" Kenya asked, voice like ice. "Or do you want to make me a better offer?" Reese's face paled. "What do you want?" Kenya took a step closer. "You pull your people off this block. You abandon every redevelopment plan involving 87th Street. And you dissolve South Shore Logistics by end of day." Reese swallowed hard. "That's extreme." Kenya's smile was razor sharp. "That's mercy." "And if I say no?" Kenya leaned in so only he could hear. "Then I do what I was trained to do." Reese didn't ask what that meant. He saw it in her eyes. The cold, unflinching certainty of someone who had ended men more powerful than him. He got back into his Escalade and left without another word. Home again. When it was over, Kenya stood on the porch, the sky lightening to soft purple, the street empty again. Loretta stepped out beside her, arms folded. "Did you win?" Loretta asked. Kenya shook her head. "Not yet." Loretta smiled softly. "But you're still standing." Kenya looked at her mother, the strongest woman she'd ever known, and for the first time in weeks, let herself breathe. "Because of you." They stood there together, side by side, watching the sun rise over a street that belonged to them, and always would.